Well, thank you for including us in the film and the VideoFest. I appreciate it. Eric and I both appreciate it. Well, as storytellers, we were always captivated by what was coming into the news, and we would follow stories and we'd see images with these stories, and we wonder what it took to get the stories. I mean, you see amazing photos all the time, people up close to the action that's happening. And we always wondered about the story behind that story. And so we just started doing some investigating, and that led us into looking at numbers from CPJ and Reporters Without Frontiers, and just realizing the risk that journalists took to get us this information. And from that, and how we met Kale is we saw her images in Unembedded, which is an amazing book, and it's 4 independent photojournalists on the war in Iraq, and we were really amazed by this book and her images. And then we started looking at the difference between the independent journalists and the mainstream media and how they were putting the story in Iraq. And then from that, it was a catalyst to just looking at the conflict zones, not just in war, but also in Mexico with the drug cartels, what was happening there, and just more about silencing journalists and the different ways that journalists are silenced and how to kill a story. Obviously, killing a story sometimes involves killing a journalist, which is the worst form of censorship. So I mean, that's basically how we got into it. And we wanted to focus on crime and corruption and conflict, and that's why we did the conflict zones and Mexico and Russia.
Kale, will you chime in and tell us sort of where you began with your career in doing this?
Sure. Well, I started working as a journalist in the mid-90s in the Balkans, and I never intended to be a war correspondent, but I was interested in the war in Bosnia, and so I went there. I went to Bulgaria, started working in Bosnia, and it sort of became my beat, sort of what was happening in the fallout of Yugoslavia, the disintegration of Yugoslavia, and I began to sort of learn how to function in a place that was dangerous, in a place that wasn't really embedded terribly in war at the time, sort of just after the conflict. And then, you know, I did that for about 6 or 7 years, covered the Balkans, and there were always little mini conflicts along the way. I started working a little bit more in the Middle East, and leading up to the war in Iraq, I felt like that, you know, I had prepared myself with this experience, and I felt like it was a conflict that was really going to be reported in a one-sided fashion by the U.S. media, mostly from the embedded perspective, or mostly from the perspective of, you know, why we were going there from the U.S. government's point of view. Being outside the country, I had a very different perspective. I was living in Europe. You know, I was surrounded by a lot of other European journalists, and
so you weren't embedded.
So I wasn't embedded, no. So I decided to go to Iraq if I could go completely unembedded and be in Baghdad and cover the situation and the conflict from the perspective of Iraqi civilians and Iraqis, not from the U.S. perspective. So in 2003, I managed to get myself there just before the invasion, and I stayed on and off for 2 years before and after the invasion. I went back in 2011.
And if you have had the opportunity to see the film, Kale's images are amazing, and it's not that we're pro freelance journalists over the embedded mainstream media, but we look at both and how both operate in these conflict zones, and why and how they're at risk, and maybe how those risks are different. And then also talking about in the movie about the risk that the local journalists take. Yeah. The risks to local journalists are so huge because they don't have the luxury of leaving these places that they're reporting from, and we rely on them for that information. They know the lay of the land, and I think that Kale can attest to this because she was there working with local journalists, and those people are her friends and her conduits too.
Yeah, it's true. You know, that it's one thing to be a foreigner and go to a dangerous conflict and cover it, It's another level of risk when you're a freelancer, because media organizations are glad to take your work, and freelancers really provide, particularly photographers, but increasingly of all types, provide a lot of that frontline coverage in risky zones, because freelancers are willing to take that extra risk to get there. They tend to be a little younger. They tend to be really committed personally to telling a story, or feeling like that there's some kind of justice that needs to be served in telling this story, and they're willing to work for less money, and they're willing to work without insurance. So you find a lot of really young people covering conflict, some of them with very little experience on the front lines, and big media organizations are glad to take their work because it's cheap and it's a lot less liability than sending one of their staffers. So that's another level of sort of investment and risk. And then there's local journalists who, if you live in a place that happens to be very dangerous or corrupt, then you don't have a choice. If you want to be a journalist and you want to tell a meaningful story, you've got to take risks, and your family's at risk as well.
What are your feelings about what's currently happening to some of the journalists with being held captive for long terms and then executed on video? How does that make you feel?
I mean, it's horrifying because that's always it's always a journalist's greatest fear, right? Is that you're going to become the story, and that you're going to first get kidnapped, because there's nothing really worse that can happen to you, because then you're totally outside of you have no power, and anything can happen. And then to be, executed in such a horrific way in front of your friends and family in the world is the last thing that you want to have happen, mostly because you're so concerned. I mean, as you're out there telling a story you think is important. You know what risks you're taking, but then to have to put your friends and family through a horrible, traumatic experience like that is just the worst thing that can happen to you as a journalist. And journalists and aid workers increasingly have become targets. Some people would argue in part because of the sort of ideological nature of these conflicts, and they get cast in such a way, and that it's sort of East versus West, or one country versus another, or one ideology against another, not only by the people involved in the conflict, but also increasingly, I think, the U.S. military, when they get involved in something and say, well, we're a humanitarian mission here in Iraq. We're here to free the Iraqi people. And then aid workers, well, if you're a humanitarian, then the aid workers who work with you must also be fair game as targets. So there's been kind of a blurring of the lines too, that I think the U.S. approach to fighting has encouraged a little bit. But particularly in the early days of the Iraq War. So yeah, I mean, it's a horrific thing, but it's also inevitable. I mean, it's war, and if it's a high profile kind of taking a Western captive, then it's really great publicity.
So looking back on your years in the Balkans, did you ever feel personally in peril, like with what happened in Iraq and what's been going on here lately?
Well, what's shifted, and I think Iraq really was the shifting point for this in a lot of ways, the conflict in Iraq for Western journalists, American journalists. And when I was in the Balkans, I never felt like I was at risk because I was a target as a journalist. Not very often. I wasn't at risk of being kidnapped. I was at the same risk everyone else around me was, because pieces of metal are flying around.
Right, sure.
So there's that risk, but I never felt like I was a target, and that changed in Iraq for certain. I've been other places where it's very violent, in the the West Bank and Israel and Palestine, and again, I never felt a target specifically. Not very often anyway. One time the Israelis shot at my car.
Oh.
And it was very clearly marked as a television, marked TV all over it, but so they knew who we were, but never in any other place. And that's shifted. And it's shifted in Iraq, and it's shifted with this sort of war on terror, where it's us against them, kind of this very general, vague battle line.
Well, there was a point in time when when journalists put TV on their cars so that they would not be targeted, and they would be seen as neutral parties, and that they could cross over from one side of the conflict to another to get everyone's POV. But that did change, as Kale mentioned, because now if you put TV on your vehicle or your flak jacket or you're standing out, then you do become a target. And it's sad that journalists can't be seen as neutral parties, that they're now seen as pawns for political or financial gain by militia groups or cartels or whoever it is that needs that chip to barter with. It is really tragic. And, these militia groups don't follow rules of Geneva Convention, so there are lots of risks for journalists out there, and aid workers, and other people that might be seen as an ATM machine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Although I will say that it depends conflict to conflict. There are still some places where journalists get a little more respect and protection, and both sides can kind of see the value of having them there. But those are very politicized, very media saturated conflicts, like Israel and Palestine is one of those places, I would say.
What about Rosebud? I mean, are you familiar with that story that John Stewart just shot, and the local journalist, and are you afraid of working with them, what you're maybe doing?
No, which story are you referring to?
John Stewart, and with the satire, the things that they were accusing this guy of, he's like, it's a comedy show. I wasn't.
The Iranian
yeah,
story, yeah.
But I mean, he was legitimately concerned after that about even involving journalists. This guy went to jail for being in a parody, essentially.
Right, and each country has its own strange logic and its own parameters depending on what's happening there with the media. Russia and Mexico and Iran are some of the most difficult places, I think, to be a journalist, but each one for different reasons. Journalists are silenced by different forces and challenged by different factions.
Well, we've heard just thinking of the journalists that we've heard, the Bob Woodward, and Daniel Pearl, and some of the more high profile, but we don't really ever hear the story behind the stories of the other journalists that American journalists even, and especially not the local journalists. We don't hear those stories ever.
No.
So the one thing that I kept coming away from it with is, how in the world do we change this? How do we make, the documentary really opens up the dialogue and shows that this is happening. But, you're kind of left with going, how do we do? How do we make that different? How do we make it different?
Well, each country has its own media environment, and, the United States also has, it's not always easy to be a journalist here either. Anyone who has challenged a really sensitive and difficult story at high levels of power will know that. Mm-hmm. So, I think we're responsible first for our own backyard and making sure that we are concerned with the value. First of all, pay for media, pay for information because it's valuable. Mm-hmm. And citizen journalists are becoming increasingly important, but act like a journalist if you're a citizen journalist. There are things that we can do to make sure that the media continues to get the respect it needs to function. Mm-hmm. And we need the media more than ever, right? Because there's so many lacks of transparency in the way that we do business and the way that politics are managed, and the sort of gap between power and civilians and citizens seems to be ever growing in this country and in many places. So I think it's just something we have to be sure we value. And we invest in, we pay for the news, and we pay attention to the news, and we are engaged citizens. So that's the first step. Doing it in your own backyard.
Well, and the part about Mexico really hit me as well, because if there aren't journalists who report on all of the drug trafficking going on, I bet it would just seem like if people aren't hearing about it anymore, then, they might think that it stopped when it obviously
Well, they know it hasn't stopped because the violence is still there.
Right.
And the sort of consequences are they might not know what's going on or who's in power or who's who. that's a terrifying state to live in.
Yeah.
You never want to be in that position.
Yeah.
So remember that when you think about supporting the media.
And to go back to, sorry, I didn't mean to step on you. And to go back to how we are aware of what's going on to journalists, not only in the United States but also across all borders. It's a cornerstone of civil society to have a free and investigative press. And if that doesn't exist, there's no freedom of press, then we're not getting the story. And if journalists are intimidated, then we're not getting the full story. And journalists are practicing self-censorship, or they're not going to these places where the stories are originating. So as people that are ingesting the news, the general public, you and me and other people at this table who are reporting the news and also absorbing the news, it's important for people not to be so cynical about the media. And I think that there's a cynicism that creeps in, and then also like, who is a journalist and who isn't a journalist. I think the story is important, and how do we get the information? And yes, I think it's important to triangulate and practice good journalism, but I think that the journalists have responsibility, but the audience also has responsibility. And so many of these mandates that are meant to protect journalists and civilians, they're not enforceable, and they don't have a lot of teeth. And stuff is happening in the United States that is trampling our First Amendment rights, and it's really frustrating to see that because, look at the Daniel Pearl Freedom of Information Act that the United States is saying to other countries, there should be freedom of press. But then you look at Ferguson, what happened there, and there's a lot of First Amendment rights that are being violated. So it's really frustrating. And is there one way to say, oh, this is a way to solve a problem, or an action we can take? No, not really. But I think awareness and a continued conversation and a lack of cynicism is good. And citizen journalism. I love citizen journalism. I love all news, and I think also, I know I'm ranting a little bit, but we all get a lot of news coming to us, and some of us click and forward, and I'm guilty of it on occasion, without really investigating what is this and who is it coming from, and is it shareable, and is it newsworthy, and who's the source. So anyhow, that's my rant.
I got a quick question. I watched the movie, I really enjoyed it a lot, but a question keep on popping in my head, and I would like to really get your opinion on this. When you had, let's go back to Vietnam. When you had Cronkite in Vietnam, he would shoot something, and then he would go back and edit it, and then it would be up into the satellite, and then put on this, evening news. Even during the first Gulf War, where Norman Schwarzkopf was commander, you would have stuff shot and then edited and then go back. Now, you can literally shoot something and it be on every cable news network within 30 minutes. And do you think because of technology that's putting you guys more in danger? Because we know the terror groups are very technology savvy. They use YouTube, Instagram, Facebook for propaganda. You know that they're monitoring these things. So you're reporting in a war zone, you upload, CNN uploads it, or gets on Reuters or the UPI or Associated Press. You don't have time to get out. Do you think because the technology is putting you guys more in danger because it's more instantaneous, they know where you guys are, and they know that if they can get you, that makes a big story?
That's a good question. I don't know that it makes us more at risk. I mean, we're out there in the field. They can see us on the street. They don't have to wait for the news feed to come in. So when I'm working in Iraq, there are times when we function by this 15-minute rule. You stay nowhere longer than 15 minutes because it gives people time to figure out a strategy to block your exit route and figure out a way to kidnap you. I would say that in some places in Iraq that's down to like the 15-second rule today. But so I think that it's an interesting point, because what I am most concerned about in regards to the quick turnaround of images in particular is that my sources, the people I photograph, are at risk, because once my photographs end up on my news agency's website and they get bought and sold to whomever from there. Now this woman who is defying maybe some militia's command that she should always cover her face, or not be a dancer, or not work, or not drink alcohol, or if I photograph her doing anything that's outside of the parameters of what she's supposed to be doing, and I photographed a lot of women in Iraq, now I have to worry that her safety is jeopardized because anyone's going to see her picture online. So we have to be very careful about protecting our sources and still getting the story out. That's a big concern for me. And I have tortured over showing photographs, sending photographs, and filing them to my agent or to a news source because I'm worried about that person having some sort of consequences in her neighborhood in pretty real time, like within weeks. So that's a concern. And also another thing that's happening, which is interesting, is just to sort of talk for a second about images, and not really in misappropriation, but images are circulating online and misused in ridiculous ways. Like women who are photographed in one country in West Africa will be stand-ins for girls who are hostages in another country without the photographer's knowledge or permission. And that kind of thing is happening at an increasing rate. So there are a lot of concerns with the way that information gets turned around online, but I really like Trisha's point that we can't become cynical, we just have to get smarter as news consumers. We can't think that simply because sometimes things are misused, or sometimes, and this is a bit of a tangent, or sometimes things are not accurate, that means that they're always, we should just toss our hands up and say there's no truth anymore. And that's not true. There are people who really, like the people in this film, these local journalists who put their lives on the line to get facts out and to verify them. And things are verifiable. And so we have to be smart news consumers too, and figure out where our sources are and do our homework and understand how the media functions.
I thought of it when I saw the documentary, and I'm sorry I'm going to be wrong, but I almost see it as they spoke about procedures being set up to set safety guidelines for journalists in those areas, whether it be, tripods are wrapped with neon orange tape at the top and bottom, so when they're looking at distance, they can say, okay, that's a tripod and not a 50 cal or something. Where do you draw the line? Because it's almost, if you set those procedures, the guerrilla fighters in whatever area could adopt them in some way to masquerade as press when they're not, and then they get in closer for a kill. And I was in the Navy and been to the Persian Gulf, so I understand a little bit of what they, the difficulties are. And anyone who's seen, Generation Kill on HBO, I considerably worry myself about more than gung-ho reservists that get dropped into the area and are really just looking to go to guns.
Yeah. And we've seen it go both ways.
That could be dealt with.
I mean, these situations are so fluid, and I think that as a journalist on the ground, you have to be smart about what works there in that place, how you present yourself, how you protect yourself. There are journalism training courses increasingly that even freelancers can take and they can afford, and there are some funding mechanisms so that freelancers can get access to them. Combat preparedness courses, so you learn first aid, and you learn how to function if you're kidnapped. And you learn what to do if you're working in a hostile environment and you're not sure who's who and who to trust, and how to get out quickly and how to keep a low profile, just basic things like that.
Do you receive search and evasion tactic training?
I've never taken one of those training courses, and the courses are really they're about personal safety, like how do you keep yourself alive and how do you save your colleagues' lives, and a lot of it's medically based. I think that's one of the most important things that journalists need working in a conflict zone like that. But same should go for military training when you're talking about, say, our military, which we can control and have something to say about. It's important to sort of be able to identify what kinds of things might demonstrate someone's a journalist, and when to withhold fire until you can figure it out, because it's worth holding fire usually to figure it out.
Yes.
And journalists, can blend, local journalists in particular, I know several in Iraq who they look like the guys around them, and I've been, hanging out with those militias myself, in situations where if someone's looking through the scope of a gun, they might just think I'm another citizen of Iraq. So, I mean, the only thing we can do is sort of train our military to be circumspect in those situations and not shoot at everything that moves in certain circumstances, but there's a level of risk.
Well, yeah, and they had the whole, the clarification call and then the tally-ho. I mean, they gave it to them straight up. They were like, no, they're carrying weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, camera. Like,
Yeah,
I
it's
was
scary.
It was scary to me because I look at myself as being ex-military. I considered doing freelancing in the Persian Gulf, and documentary opened my eyes.
Yeah, and then also remember that that's just when between journalists and combatants, right?
Yeah.
But what about combatants and civilians?
Yeah.
I mean, we know that in modern warfare that civilians die in larger numbers than combatants do, because there's no, we don't fight the way we used to. People are embedded in communities when they fight, and often our fighting is done from a great distance. So
It's
there's a
9
lot
o'clock.
to think about there.
I saw all but about the last 15 minutes of the film. So I want to know, did you, in that part, did you cover the story of Tim Hetherington in the film?
Yes, about
We
Tim.
touched briefly on Tim, but we did not tell his own personal story. In the same way that we talked a little bit about Marie Colvin and Remy, we addressed that these people had lost their lives and the search of the story. We did not tell his story. His story had already been told by the time we did our film, and it was done well before we got to tell us the bigger story about journalists in different areas and different forms of censorship. I mean, don't forget there's also Mexico and Russia. It's not just about conflict zones. But yeah, there's so many people that whose stories we didn't include in the film. There's far too many sad endings for journalists, and we wouldn't be able to address all of them. But our hearts go out to them and to their family and to the loss of their voice in the journalism community. And it's these numbers aren't going down. These numbers of journalists being kidnapped and the imprisonment, it's not, these numbers aren't becoming less and less. It's becoming more and more prevalent, and it's really depressing. And it's great that awareness is building. Even people that had no idea that the journalists were facing these types of censorship and threats to their lives are actually talking about it now. So it's the one thing that's happening is it's becoming a conversation. But how do we solve the problem dealing with militia groups, and how do we even get our own government to build better protections for journalists here at home? So yeah, that was a long answer to your question.
One thing it might speak to, though, is that the media continues to be powerful. I mean, journalists aren't dying because they're not important. They're dying and they're being targeted because information is increasingly important on a global level. Like, these are happening in international conflicts, they're happening in criminal conflicts where there's a lot of gang violence and criminal violence. They're happening in environments where there's a lot of political repression. I mean, if the Russian government's so powerful, how come they have to silence so many journalists? Just because they have a power there, and so that's something to remember. If there's a silver lining to this story, maybe that's it. Information is effective, and so journalism is still effective.
Yeah, and then we can all be part of the story. That we can all be reporting the news. So there's more of us reporting the news and becoming citizen journalists. There's no way that we can all be oppressed, right? So there is something about a collective consciousness and about the need for people. The people want information, and that is something that we address in our film. People want information, and they want to have all sides of the story. They want to be able to make informed decisions, and they want to live in a civil society. So there is this need, and there's this urgency, and there's this desire. And as Kale said, the news is important. The information is important. So that's where the power plays come in, and that's why journalists are targeted, whether it's in Mexico, Russia, or conflict zones. It's just some instances are really dire.
Well, if there's one positive part of Tim Hetherington's story. The first aid, a lot of that came from his friends because he died of bleeding out. It wasn't,
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned
and
that.
They realized that they needed the training. So I know a lot of them really fought for that training.
Yeah, one of the arteries in his legs was one of his legs was cut, and no one there knew how to apply enough pressure.
Yeah, didn't have calipers, it wasn't gonna happen.
Yeah, in the field, and it took them a while to get him
He came
help.
through here when he was promoted to Shreppo. I got to talk to him, me and several other people, journalists, but he was
Oh,
a
good.
really impressive man.
Yeah, he really was.
He was, I mean, I talked to him for, I don't know, an hour and I still remember it.
Yeah, he was doing interesting work and really very driven. And his the co-director of that film, Restrepo, Sebastian Junger, is the one who started this one of the newest funds to train journalists, to help journalists get medical training so they can use it in the field. So that's yeah, it's a really great piece of filmmaking too. But again, there's a freelancer who put himself out on the line. And I think Sebastian Junger was under some sort of contract. He often is, but he started as a freelancer also. And these are people who spent their lives, educating themselves how to cover conflict and putting their lives on the line to do it. They knew what they were doing.
Yeah, there has to be a real passion there to go into those conflict zones. There has to be a real passion to tell that story and get that story. I mean, Kayla's a testament to it. She wanted to tell a side that wasn't being widely reported. So that's commendable. That's amazing. And someone looks at the news and says, "Hey, there's some voices missing here. I'm going to go out and get those voices on record, and I'm going to document this." And it's inspiring, really.
Well, I mean, the literal rule of journalism is that you should present both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And when we only have one side presented, we only have half the story.
Mm-hmm.
And half the story cannot be what comes back to America when we make the decision to go, as I said, to go to guns.
Yeah, and that goes for any story. However horrific the other side may seem, there's still a story to be told there. ISIS is an example, right? Or the IS is an example. Like, what is this organization? Where do they come from and why? That's a really good story. That's the story that we're not hearing so much of. I mean, it's out there. People are reporting it.
I did like the Daily Show's little take on it with the whole, oh no, they've got Final Cut Pro.
And they've got a lot of money, and they're getting a lot of oil money. They're really well funded as well. But who are these people who come from all over the Middle East, and why? Is a question that I've always been interested in, and it started long ago. But Iraq is one of these things, these conflicts that kind of has these concentric circles of implication on. And I think what we're seeing now, you can draw a direct lineage back to what happened in 2003.
Why don't you think we get the whole story here in America? Because I'm finding myself, just as a consumer of news, and if somebody wants to be informed, I have to go to foreign websites like the BBC, NDTV in India, Jerusalem Post in Israel, Haaretz, these little tiny newspapers in South Africa. Why aren't we getting the full story? Because, like you said, ISIS and IS, some of these other news organizations have gone the full story, but it doesn't get back here to America. And even if you watch CNN International and CNN Arabic and CNN Domestic, you get 3 different stories.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you think we get the whole story?
Well, also news is a business, right? And so we cater to the odd news, especially the larger the media, the more powerful its business interests are. And I think they cater to the perspectives of the people that that they know their audience. But also, I mean, it's an old adage that the truth is the first casualty in wartime, and it's because we know what sounds right to us, that sounds familiar and safe, and that will make sense. And that's when our government wants to go to war, it's a powerful machine, and it's a powerful message they have to send out, and they have their fingers in all the right places, and they know how to get their message across. And as journalists, we just have to make sure that we provide whatever balance we can. And as a consumer, increasingly, luckily, you have access to the internet and all of these other sources. And there are good sources here too. I mean, Al Jazeera America is an alternative source that's going full steam ahead and a pretty powerful voice in the United States now.
They got a lot of local journalists.
And they've got a lot of,
working now.
and they speak the local languages, and a lot of American journalists. I have a lot of colleagues who work for them after spending a lot of time in the field and just looking for a more balanced outlet. And there are a lot of great academics that have blogs. I mean, there is no end to sources. You just sort of have to tap into them. But yeah, I think our domestic news organizations are really a little bit under the thumb of the official line that comes out of Washington.
I'm a big believer that in the Middle East especially, firepower cannot be the comforter that puts us to sleep at night. Because
We see what that's done. I mean, just, throwing more violence at the situation doesn't really seem to work. And so we've got to sort of step back and ask, well, what's the problem? What's the foundational problem here?
where's the why?
Yeah. And, Iraqis will be the first ones to tell you that maybe the bombing's not going to work. It's not only, critics here.
It's a culture that's been there forever, maybe a slow answer.
But it's also
There's a better
it's an
answer.
import. I mean, this ISIS is largely an import.
Mhm.
It's not a fully Iraqi movement. It's something that's kind of coagulating between forces across the Middle East.
Where do the both of you see the coverage for Syria going?
Do you want to speak to that, Tricia?
About Syria, well, I agree with Kayla. I think Al Jazeera is doing a good job. Al Jazeera was vilified for a while that they were spokespeople for militia groups, but I think that smear campaign has faded, and people are realizing that Al Jazeera is doing a good job. Like you guys said, that they speak the reporters speak the language, the local dialects. But Syria, there's so much danger there for journalists that honestly, that's one of the places where we aren't getting as much information as we would like to make informed decisions. And I was speaking with Kale earlier today about local journalists being afraid to go in, Western media being afraid to go in for good reason. So I don't know, Kale, if you want to mention anything about the local journalists that you've been in contact with reporting near Syria or that have decided not to go in for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I think there are journalists working there. I don't know the landscape that well of the local media in Syria, or that's reporting abroad. But one thing I've noticed, and colleagues have started, I use Facebook kind of professionally because I have colleagues all over the world, and they'll post things there, and then I'll follow up, and sort of it gives me ideas. And one thing that I saw posted recently on Facebook was a video of a woman who was in full niqab, is what they call it sometimes in Iraq. She's wearing like black head to toe in one of these cities that's controlled by the IS on the border with Syria. And she's got a hidden camera, and she's sort of walking through her town, filming people stopping on her on the street, asking her, you're not covered enough, or giving her a hard time. And you see kids and mothers going to the playground, and people carrying guns on the street, and all the women are clothed in black, which was not what Iraq was like, by the way, before the IS got there, or before some of these other militant groups started imposing their own views of things. And she goes into an internet cafe, and there are all these women speaking French, fluent French, speaking back home to their families. And one of the things that is happening is you find Europeans, not only militants, fighters, but also people who are very dogmatic, who decide they're attracted to this idea of an Islamic state in the middle of the Middle East. And so you have all sorts of people are being attracted to these ISIS locations. It's a fascinating phenomenon that's happening. And we have to ask ourselves why. And these are people coming from, firstly, Denmark, some from France. I mean, Europe is much closer to Iraq than we are. So the Europeans are really worried about terrorist attacks in their backyard because they have so many connections and so many immigrants. It's a really interesting time. So I guess the point is that there are lots of interesting channels we're going to start to see information coming through because all of these devices are so easy to carry around, and the internet's accessible, and there are internet cafes everywhere. And again, we have to make sure we're vetting those videos and that information. Look how ISIS is using the internet. I mean, it's a brand new world for information. So we just need people who are savvy and are combing the web for what's new and how else we can use and decipher what's out there.
Were you in any precarious situations just making this film, getting some of that footage, and interviewing the people that you interviewed?
Well, I didn't do any of the filming. That was all the filmmakers and the people, the other videographers in that source. I mean, my own photographs, yes. I mean, those were not always safe to get. But I didn't make any of the video footage. It's in the film. It's only my still photographs.
The two scenes that were about journalists getting kidnapped from a film point of view, is that the actual footage they were able to shoot? And like people were breaking into their cars?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? It was echoey.
What's
yeah.
About the, I was amazed by some of the footage from like the two instances where journalists were kidnapped. And it's like they were still able to shoot a little footage before their cameras were taken away. It's pretty scary stuff.
Oh, are you talking about the footage with Florence Abuenas?
Yeah.
She was telling her story, so we did B-roll to match her story when she was talking about being in the car. She was kidnapped in front of Baghdad University by men with AK-47s, and then she was shoved into a car, and she was telling us how she felt like she was crossing over onto the other side of the mirror. So we put that together, B-roll, based on her storytelling, and that was in Baghdad, but it wasn't any part of her.
So there's a little bit of recreation though.
Yes, the short answer would be is recreated. I don't like to give short answers, apparently.
But
Yeah.
there's another kidnapping where you actually see the kidnapper coming into the car and the guy trying to fend him off, and it's real quick, but it's amazing bit of footage. It's the real thing. I guess he had the camera going.
I think that might have been another reenactment. Was that when David Rode was speaking about his kidnapping?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was another reenactment.
Okay.
There weren't a lot of reenactments, but you know, it's important to have the story for the story to gain momentum. And there's a lot of archival footage of David when he was kidnapped in Bosnia, and then there was some archival footage of the militia group that kidnapped him, but he did not film any of his actual kidnapping. So again, that was a reenactment.
David Rhodes' story, by the way, if you want to sort of follow up, and you can follow up on any of these journalists in the film and get a really much better and more nuanced sense of what the political situation is in that place. And David Rode, in particular, he was kidnapped on the border with Pakistan, and he has an amazing story to tell about what motivates those militants and what motivated his captors.